One of the first cameras you started out with was the H16 Bolex. It's still very much in use today. The clockwork motor runs for 23 seconds, which is limiting. What are your experiences with this camera?
Well, I shot in the old days. I shot quite a few films on this camera alone, like Refuge England, for instance, is one that comes to mind. I think yes, Mama Don't Allow was shot on the Bolex as well. All the 16mm films in the early days were certainly shot on the Bolex, which limits you to 23 seconds. But that's quite good discipline, because when you're not shooting dialogue, when you're not filming dialogue, the shortness of the run is not so much as a limitation as it would be when you are filming dialogue. So I have never found that. It's irksome occasionally, but I've never found it to be a real limitation. And even nowadays, I mean, I use this camera. I've got a Bolex, my own. I had quite a bit of equipment over the years, and the Bolex is all that's left of it, actually. I've still got that, and I was using it a fortnight ago to shoot some extra stuff for a film that I directed and photographed in France. Part of a series about formal gardens, which is going to be transmitted on Channel 4 in November. And I just went up with the Bolex for some extra shooting, and it was fine. And it was very good because it has very fast lenses, and it's had those fast lenses. The Bolex had fast lenses before Zeiss or Panavision ever had fast lenses. In fact, before Panavision was even invented, they had lenses faster than T2. All my Bolex lenses are faster than T2.
Do you think 16, 25 and 75 is still the best lens selection?
No, I don't think it ever was. And when I bought my own Bolex, I deliberately chose to have a 50 instead of a 75, otherwise the gap was much too big. So on my Bolex I've actually got 16, 25 and 50. And later I also bought the zoom for it and a 10mm. But I very rarely use those. 16, 25, 50 is not a bad selection, actually. Much better than 16, 25, 75.
Do you prefer zoom lenses or prime lenses?
Well, each has its own use. I think quality-wise, zoom lenses are now so good that you can treat them as primes as far as quality is concerned. And so, therefore, I tend to work, if I'm working on 35mm, I tend to work on prime lenses indoors and on zoom lenses outdoors, but I just use the zoom lens as a rubber lens just to get my setting quickly, because zooming in itself needs to be very carefully controlled, and I think there should be such a thing as a zoom license, that you only have so many zooms per film because it can be abused very easily.
What were the other early cameras you used?
Well, I've used Arris all my life, really, principally. So in 16mm, I used the Bolex, and in 35 I used the Arri, the various Arris, Arri 2A, 2B, 2C, with or without blimp. And the only other early camera that I've used a lot of is a Newman Sinclair. But that, of course, I always preferred the Arri to that, and we only used the Newman if there was no Arri was available or something like that for some reason. It's okay on a tripod, but again, it's a spring loaded camera, and you can get an electric motor for it. But the basic Newman was a spring-wound camera like the Bolex, so you were limited to a certain run. And I remember one instance sitting on the roof of a building overlooking the Manchester Ship Canal, but we were waiting for a ship to come out of the fog, and after sitting up there and freezing for 2 hours, when the ship finally appears, we turned the Newman on and the spring broke. So we weren't very pleased.
Humphrey Jennings used the Newman Sinclair a lot in his films with that camera, are recognised as being quite historically significant.
Yes. Well, it was in very general use in the 40s and 50s, yes, into the 50s.
What are the differences between lighting for black and white and lighting for colour?
Oh, how many hours have you got for me to talk about that? But basically, I'm always very keen that the students here at the film school learn about black and white, that they shoot at least one film in black and white. Because if you can light black and white, you can colour as a walkover, but not the other way around. Colour makes things much easier because you don't have to work for separation and for tonality, difference of tonality and so on, and colour does it all for you. You can have very flat light in colour. I mean, you couldn't shoot black and white with this kind of setup. It wouldn't look good at all. But in colour it looks fine. In fact, it's better.
When you come on a location for the first time, what do you do?
Get the aspirins out. No, I have a look at the location from the point of view of which way it faces, which way where the sun rises, where the sun sets in relation to the location. If it's an indoor location, as many of them are, I always I stand on tiptoe and I go down on my knees to see where the horizon lies outside the windows, because that can be very important for the need for fill light and for for balancing indoor and outdoor, for the need to put window filters up, which sort of window filters you might need. You just generally suss the place out, and indoors again, on an indoor location, you would need to suss out where you could put lights within the location without bothering the actors too much, without encroaching on the acting space. And outdoors too, particularly if it's a night location, if you're looking at a location for a night shoot, then it's very important to find out where to suss out where you can put the lights, where towers might need to be erected, where rooftops are available, that kind of thing.
What were the problems of matching film types in A Taste of Honey?
Well, it wasn't so much a problem of matching film types, it was my idea, which came directly out of my experience on documentaries immediately prior to that, on the free cinema documentaries. My idea to shoot the film on 3 different film stocks, and the idea there was that one could give a location a certain look, not only by the lighting and the art direction, the dressing of the location, but also by the choice of the film stock. So that the early locations in the early part of Taste of Honey, which were meant to look particularly grotty, were shot on a very grainy film stock, which had only just been invented, called Ilford HPS. And then the outdoor locations were on a more normal kind of film stock, which was the Ilford equivalent of Plus X, which was called FP3. And then there was also an intermediate film stock, which we used for the later locations, which is now called HP5, but had another name then. And that was a very revolutionary thing to do, and the lab was very, everybody advised me not to do it, because in those days, to use anything but Plus X was really considered not the thing to do on a feature film. It might be on a documentary or on a newsreel, they said, but you wouldn't consider to use a grainy film stock for its grain. That, of course, was a completely new concept.
Is a close collaboration with the lab important?
Of course, very important. And it's very important to have a chap at the other end of the telephone, if you're 3,000 miles away, who can give you a sensible report and not sort of be wary of saying anything, committing himself. If you've got a scratch, it's nice to know if it's a bad scratch or a light scratch. And most lab representatives are not prepared to commit themselves, because a lot of money rides on those kind of decisions, and they reckon they're not being paid to make those sort of decisions. So I followed one man from lab to lab. Every time he changed lab, I changed lab. So I could have that particular man on the end of the telephone if I'm phoning from another country.
You worked on such early films as Saturday Night, Together, Wakefield Express, The Reinstallations and Refuge England. How do these low-budget films compare to low-budget films today?
Well, I think there's not a great deal of difference, actually, except that the equipment, there's much more range of equipment available. It's much easier to make a low-budget film now, because in those days, if you couldn't get enough light into a location, you couldn't shoot in that location. So to shoot in relatively small locations only became possible, interiors I'm talking about, only became possible because of the invention of these fast stocks, because otherwise, by the time you got the necessary lights into the location, there wouldn't be any room for the actors.
Every Day Except Christmas was Lindsay Anderson's first reasonably budgeted film. What do you think of Lindsay as a director?
Well, I've always admired Lindsay as a director very much. I've always thought that he was about the best director that we had over many years, and I think that may still be true, although he hasn't worked a great deal in England lately. But I've always admired Lindsay's work very much, and we worked very, very well together, and that's why I rather regretted that it never came about that I shot any of his features for various reasons.
Ford sponsored a second film. This was Carol Rice's first real chance at direction, again made with Leon Claw's company, Graphic Films. You did the camera work on this film as well. How does the style of We Are the Lambeth Boys compare with Every Day Except Christmas?
Well, there are certain similarities, but the differences in the style are the differences between the approach of Lindsay and the approach of Carol. So Lindsay, I think, is the more emotional director out of the two. Carol is more cerebral. He's cooler in a way. But of course, the films also have certain similarities, which you could say stem from me, or at least they stem from the type of approach that I used in collaboration with those two directors, which all to do with handheld, when you use handheld cameras and the type of lighting, the general sort of approach to the subject, which the free cinema films, they had a certain amount of things in common, but they also had individual differences which stem from the directors.
What do you think are the similarities between free cinema's style and Humphrey Jennings' style of poetic realism?
Well, I think there's a considerable overlap because we were very influenced by Humphrey Jennings. We admired Humphrey Jennings very much, particularly Lindsay did. And I think the term poetic realism, which was applied to Humphrey's work, is also applicable to a large chunk of free cinema.
There seems to be similarities between the statue sequences filmed in A Taste of Honey and in We Are the Lambeth Boys. Do you agree with this?
You bet there are. You could say one was a straight steal from the other. It's as simple as that. But we liked it. So when we saw it in the Lambeth Boys, we liked it so much that we just used it again on Taste of Honey for the title sequence.
Were there any dealings with Joan Littlewood's theatre workshop apart from using Murray Melvin in A Taste of Honey?
Well, yes and no. I mean, Tony Richardson, of course, had lots of dealings with Joan Littlewood, although he was in a way working for the rival establishment, the Royal Court. But there were lots of dealings, and I personally also shot a little film for Joan, which never saw the light of day. It wasn't, you couldn't call it a documentary exactly, but it was a little film to promote, a promotional film to promote her idea of a fun palace in the East End in Docklands, which never happened. The film never happened and the fun palace never happened, but we did a week's shooting or so, which was quite fun.
Have you met Sheila Delaney?
Yes, indeed, yes.
Can you say anything about her?
Not really anything in particular. I mean, it's a long time ago, but we worked quite closely together. You know, she was around when we were shooting Taste of Honey, and I've seen her off and on since that time.
Did you go to any of the free cinema screenings at the National Film Theatre?
Yes, all of them. Yes, we went to all of them. I mean, it was a very small, close-knit group. The whole thing about free cinema, and to some extent Woodfall and what you might term the new wave, should really be called the new ripple, because compared with what happened in France at the same time, where I think 60 directors or something made their first film, what happened in England was very, very small, very minor, and a very short duration and a very minor influence in what followed. I think Lindsay made that point somewhere in something he wrote.
Labyrinth was perhaps the biggest piece of installation art ever. What do you think of it now?
Well, I think Labyrinth was it was a success in a way, but to me it was always a bit of a disappointment because of I saw it as being over-ambitious. And I can remember we were sitting around when we were at the planning stages. We were sitting around there, sticking pins in maps as to where we might go to film, because the subject was so wide-ranging that it was just wide open. And the execution of the thing, the 3 pavilions that comprised Labyrinth, there were 2 theatres and an in-between pavilion, which was really a sort of light show, were meant to link psychologically very closely, and they never did. That part of the project was never really fully realised. But of course Labyrinth did lead to the creation of IMAX, and I'm still in touch with the people who run IMAX, because I think there are considerable untapped possibilities in that even now, particularly now.
John Fletcher was a collaborator in free cinema. Can you say something about his contribution?
Oh, his contribution was enormous. I mean, he was as central a character to free cinema as myself or Lindsay or Carol. He made an enormous contribution. He was an incredibly enthusiastic person and an incredibly nice person, and he was my best friend for all those years until he died, sadly, quite young, in '86, I think.
The canal location in A Taste of Honey, where Joe and Jeff go on a raft, seems almost as grim as though it were built. Was it dressed for the scene?
Not really, no. I mean, it was dressed in putting the raft down and things like that, but we didn't have to sort of import the rubbish. That was all there.
Do you prefer shooting interiors in a studio or on location?
I think it's entirely horses for courses. That I wouldn't have liked to have made Taste of Honey in a studio, and in fact Taste of Honey is a bit of a landmark because it was the first major film, the first film produced by a major British distributor, which was they allowed to be made entirely on location. Only 1 year previously, Woodfall tried to set that film up and wanted to make it entirely on location, and they weren't allowed to. Other films, for instance, I made a film called The Adding Machine, which is taken from a play, and which takes place, half of the film takes place in a sort of stylized heaven. Now that film you couldn't possibly make other than in a studio.
I find the outdoor shots some of the most interesting today. Was there a decision to shoot things partially as an historical document?
No, never. That was never in our minds.
Well, they do come over today partly as historical records.
Well, I suppose that's not surprising, but that was certainly not uppermost in our minds at the time. No, it's just worked out that way.
What was it like to work with Tony Richardson?
Well, it's always a very interesting collaboration with Tony because I think he had considerable talents in various. He had a marvelous talent for casting. He was a wonderful casting person. And he was very, very good with the actors because he allowed the actors to develop the scene. He never imposed himself on the actors. He nurtured the actors, and having very good actors available, that paid off handsomely. So I never had as close a collaboration with Tony as I did with Lindsay for various reasons. But one of the reasons is that on a feature you work with an operator, and you concentrate on the lighting, and therefore it's the operator who tends to work more closely with the director in some ways than the cameraman, than the director of photography, and those kind of things. But the 3 films I made with Tony were very enjoyable and very good films.
What do you think of Tom Jones now, and what do you think are its most interesting scenes?
Well, I think Tom Jones stands up remarkably well, and it keeps turning up on television and in the cinema from time to time. In America, it certainly had a second cinema release quite recently. And so I think it holds up very well. Most interesting scenes, I don't think one can pinpoint. I mean, the eating scene, of course, has become a classic, and that's one wonderful example of the way that Tony allowed the actors to develop the scene, because that scene was not conceived like that, not written like that. It was that the final nature of that scene is entirely due to the way the actors developed it for themselves. And the other interesting thing about Tom Jones is the way that the what I would call the documentary influence, the fact that we decided to shoot certain scenes almost like one would shoot a newsreel or a documentary. And the hunt scene also is a very interesting example of the intercutting of ground-based tracking shots and helicopter shots.
So many of the films of the 60s were adaptations of plays and books. Very little original material for feature films. Why do you think this was?
I don't really know. I don't know if it's that unusual. I think if you take any particular period, the 40s, the 50s, the 60s or the 80s, I doubt if the proportion of original material to non-original material varies greatly. I very much doubt it.
Do you think the films could be said to be anti-establishment, as so many of the makers are amongst the so-called angry young men?
Yes, of course, they were. But I think it's very important to realise that they weren't just anti-establishment, they were more than that. That's where the phrase poetic realism comes in, that the poetic is more important than the realism, at least in my mind.
Would you say you were an angry young man?
I think I might have been once, yes. Certainly not now. Neither angry nor young.
What do you think of claims that the social realism films were obsessed with the north of England and the lower classes?
Well, I think it's unfair to say they were obsessed with them. I think they were very much concerned with them. They were very much conscious of the fact that in Daddy's cinema, which is a French phrase originally, in Daddy's cinema, the British cinema of the 50s that preceded it, immediately preceded it, working class characters didn't appear except as sort of minor characters. There were very few working class themes, and working class characters tended to be caricatures, like Brian Forbes' many appearances as cabin boy and various sorts of lower deck characters in naval movies. So I think we were very much concerned with putting the reality of Britain on the screen, and a considerable degree of cross-fertilisation between documentary and feature.
What do you think of the label kitchen sink? Is it a fair description of social realism films?
No, I think it's a fair description of certain bad social realism films, but I think it's a very unfair description of films like Taste of Honey, which brings us back to the question of poetic realism. The important thing about Taste of Honey is that it is a poetic evocation of atmosphere. It isn't just a social document. And therein lies its value, in the combination of the theme and the treatment.
What did you think of Murray Melvin's performance as a young gay in A Taste of Honey? It's been said that 5 minutes of Murray Melvin was worth half an hour of a film like Victim.
Yes, I would be at all surprised. I think Murray Melvin's performance was marvellous, wonderful. He's a wonderful person too.
What do you think of the statements in free cinema pamphlets? These films are free in the sense that their statements are entirely personal. The image speaks, sound amplifies and comments. Size is irrelevant. Perfection is not an aim. An attitude means a style. A style means an attitude.
Yes, I agree with most of that. I mean, we wrote that, or rather we all signed it. That is from the Free Cinema Manifesto. We signed it. Lindsay, Carol, Lorenzo Mazzetti, myself, John and one other person, I think. Yes, I think that those things are absolutely true.
It's said that it was called the Committee for Free Cinema rather than Experimental Cinema in order to emphasise that they understood their work as neither introverted or esoteric. Do you agree?
Yes, I do agree. I think we certainly did understand our work as neither esoteric nor what's the other word?
Introverted.
Introvert, certainly not introverted. So yes, I do agree.
Ray Dergnat, a fairly well-known critic of the time, was highly critical of free cinema, and he said, "Mama don't allow. He's badly cut, badly shot, with no feeling for jazz, for dancing, for bodies, for clothes, or for place. Mama don't allow, and that mama is Carol Rice and Tony Richardson."
Well, all I can say about that is that Ray Dergnat is entitled to his opinion, but that all has a wholly different background. That's because Carol Rice and Lindsay and quite a few of the people were critics before they were filmmakers, and they belonged sort of to the sight and sound school of film criticism, or sequence school of film criticism, and Ray Dergnat belonged to the opposite camp. There's a lot to do with that.
Listen to Britain and Fires Were Started were two of Humphrey Jennings' best films. What do you think of things like the scene in Listen to Britain where the lorries going under the tunnel and the trains going over the railway line, things that must have taken ages to set up, and his filming in general?
Well, I don't know if they took ages to set up, but the great thing about Listen to Britain is it's a film without dialogue and without commentary. And it's the use of sound that it shows what you can do if you use sound creatively. And the other one, Fires Were Started, also is a marvellous film. I mean, the richness of human feeling in that film is fantastic. And they stand up very well if you see them today.
Have you been influenced by the Italian neo-realists?
Yes, I think we all were. It's impossible not to have been influenced by them, because we were in our formative years as creative filmmakers at the time when neorealism first exploded, as it were. It was the first of the strong post-war movements and influences on us all, I'm sure.
Carol Rice said, "You don't choose a film by theme, you choose it because you like the story and you like the characters and because you like a change of pace." Do you agree?
Yes, I think, I don't think those things are so separate. You do start with the story, hopefully you start with the story, and you're not a polemical filmmaker. I mean, some people are, I certainly are. I'm not.
What do you think of specialised art cinemas now?
I don't think there were many left, except for the regional film theatres. But I think they still have an important role to play, especially in areas of the country where there isn't anything else at all. It's that or video. So thank God for the regional film theatres.
Have you had any dealings with method actors?
Oh yes. Rod Steiger for one. I filmed Rod Steiger 3 times, and the last time was last year in Ballad of the Sad Cafe, and he's mellowed considerably. That's all I'll say.
That's all you'll say. Because I know in a film like Seance on a Wet Afternoon, the problems with method acting were so great as it virtually caused the collapse of the company.
Well, I've never had problems to that extent, no. And fortunately, those kind of problems hit the director more than they hit the cameraman, but they do hit, well, problems with actors generally, of course, do hit the cameraman, but not only method actors.
Tom Jones was a very commercial film, making about 30 million, which is about 800 million today, at today's rates. Do you know anything about the loss of the British backing for the film?
No, I don't know. All I know, it cost £450,000.
Can we talk about A Taste of Honey?
Sure.
Scenes such as the flats, and I believe it was filmed some of the flat sequence was filmed in the English stage theatres offices.
That's correct. Yes, in the English Stage Company's workshops in Chelsea. Yes, the second flat, the one with the big picture window, that was the Royal Court Theatre's workshops. Yeah, and all the interiors, with the exception of the first very small flat, all the interiors were filmed in London. Only the exteriors were filmed in Manchester and Stockport. As I say, with the exception of the very first flat that Doris Bryan and Rita Tushing stay in. That was done Dora Bryan, sorry. Yeah.
The railway bridge scene where she tells Marie she's pregnant now, that is, I think, a real piece of historical document, because you've got the misty distance with the smoke coming from the chimneys, and you've got the beautiful railway arch, and she's leaning back against the railway arch. What?
Well, that stands out in my mind, because that's, I think, probably the only time that I've ever lit a scene with sand, because to get the silhouette of Rita leaning against the railway arch to emphasise the fact that she's pregnant, only the top part of her body was against the sky, and the bottom part of her body was against the land, and the land was black with coal dust. So I had a lot of white sand put down so as to get a complete silhouette of her against a lighter background. And the other interesting thing about that scene is that the weather helped us tremendously, because as the mood of the actors changes, as the mood of the people in the scene changes, so the weather changed. So at one point in that scene, it goes from dull weather to bright weather, and they go off into the country to have their day out in the country.
The scene in the caves, I think one of them was shot with a single candle, which
one close-up was, yeah.
You claimed to it. I think you said was the first film to be shot with one candle.
Well, I didn't say it was the first film. I said it was 20 years before John Alcott, before Barry Lyndon. Yes, it was. There was one close-up in that scene, which is shot with the light of one candle, although it did have double wick in it, I think.
The kids now, they're in Taste of Honey, that they seem to be. I mean, they're always going around singing nursery rhymes.
Yeah.
And
I think that was a bit overdone, actually. The nursery rhyme aspect, that strikes me as slightly artificial now. That what they're singing and so on strikes me as slightly over the top. I mean, slightly non-naturalistic.
The carnival scene where Joe meets Jeff, I particularly like, where it starts
Yes.
on the shoes that he's bought from the shop she works in, and you're panning round. How's that all worked out?
I don't remember how that was worked out, but you must remember that in a film like that, where you have an operator, a lot of the time the exact camera movement would be worked out between the operator and the director, and the director of photography, myself, would only kind of lend an ear to those things, but be not necessarily directly responsible for the initiation of the ideas.
You know, the seaside scene where you've got all the distorted shots.
Blackpool, yes.
Blackpool. Now, that's particularly interesting, and you follow down, and you've got that sound texture built up over the top of it.
Yes, because that's a scene. It's all shot in one day. It's just an excursion from Manchester to Blackpool. That were all shot in one day, and because of the way the weather went, the weather was poor at the beginning, so we reversed the scenes round, and we shot the pier scene first, in poor weather, and there we had a blimp camera and we had tracks, and it was a completely set up scene, whereas the rest of the sequence was improvised with handheld camera and sound added afterwards.
Because you're actually quite a fan of handheld camera.
Yes, I think it has very definite uses. Yes, and that's one area where you have this cross fertilization between documentary and features, which doesn't often happen in normal features.
This was well before the advent of the Steadicam.
Oh yes, as well before Steadicam, and more importantly, before one had self-blimped, lightweight, portable sync cameras, so you could shoot sound, sync sound, and be handheld. That is a relatively recent innovation. First of all, it was only possible on 16mm when the Eclair MPR camera came out in. I think it was 1963. 63, 64. Before that, shooting sync sound handheld was a problem. There's a picture in my book of me using an Arri wrapped up in a sleeping bag, an improvised blimp made out of a sleeping bag, to get certain sync sound scenes in Lambeth Boy.
Was the lack of mobility of the sound gear being powered by about 6 12-volt batteries or whatever it was limiting in the way you could track shots?
Well, not as much, no. I mean, the limitations imposed by the sound gear were much less than the limitations imposed by the camera gear, which were enormous. And it was the invention of the Eclair MPR, as I say, is revolutionary as far as documentary is concerned, because it enabled you to shoot improvised stuff handheld and get sync sound, which you could never do before.
The Ford of Britain films.
Yes.
Now, they're the two of the earlier films that you shot, and
yes, Every Day Except Christmas. Yeah,
Every Day Except Christmas was filmed in the market.
Yes.
Now, I mean, they look quite natural and unposed, although to some degree they look like caricatures of English working people. How did you go about getting them to cooperate and act so naturally in front of the camera?
Well, that was a matter of getting to know them thoroughly before we started filming. It was a matter that we all went down there and we really got to know our 4 or 5 principal characters. So that by the time we actually started filming, they could ignore our presence. But there again, the big problem at that time was that you couldn't shoot sync sound, and be handheld or be improvised in any way. So most of those scenes, they're staged to some extent, but they're also improvised to some extent in order to allow the people to do to freedom of movement. And they were all doing in all the packing and unpacking sequences, and the unpacking of the flowers and so on. They're doing things they do every night. They've done every night for 20 years or something, or well, for a long time. So that once they get to know you, they can afford to ignore you, and they don't play to the camera or anything like that. They just get on with their job, because after all, they have to do that job in the hours that they work hard during that time they're there, from midnight till 6 or whatever it was in the morning, and they've got to get the job done. There's a lot of job to do, so eventually they forget you're there. They just get on with the job. Otherwise, you couldn't do it.
We Are the Lambeth Boys. Again, you managed to gain the cooperation of the kids. Was that by the same means?
Yes, absolutely.
And you shot that with an ST, I think, wasn't it?
No, it's 35mm.
35mm.
Same thing. Arri 2C, no blimps, except that improvised blimp. Oh, there's a scene in the Lambeth Boys. There's a long interview scene, a long sort of chat. You could call it a chat show in modern terms, where they have a discussion in the school about capital punishment, amongst other things. That's set up. That's staged, properly staged and set up. But the questions are improvised. We know what sort of questions are going to be asked roughly. But then the session just goes on, and we were set up with a tripod and a blimp camera and lights and all the rest of it, and it works. But in a situation like that, it works. But in a lot of situations, by the time you set up your camera on a tripod and your lights and your microphones and all that, the subject evaporates if they're not used to that kind of situation.
I mean, that is difficult. I mean, I know from experience that working with actors, it tends to sound like, "Hello, James.
Yes.
What are you doing today?" "Oh, I'm going to go."
Yes, right.
You managed to avoid that staginess.
Yeah, well, that's a matter of getting to know your people and making sure they're comfortable in your presence before you even start filming. Long before you start filming. So you go down there several days, maybe weeks beforehand. You get to know the people. You talk to the people. You get introduced. You get all the stuff out of the way, and then you do it.